Okay, it looks like our feed is live. I'm James Wilson with LSU Press. I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. We're going to be getting started in just a few moments. We're going to let the few stragglers join before we get into the heart of the program. Certainly, we appreciate you taking time out of your day to tune in with us here. Uh, yeah, so Chris, we were talking a little earlier about, you said this was your second book?
Yeah, just double checking. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, sounds great.
Great. Yeah, this is the second book. The first book was a political biography of a gentleman named William L. Dawson. He was a Black congressman in Chicago from 1945 until the early 70s. And he was arguably the most powerful African American elected politician of the mid 20th century. He played a key role in desegregating many of the functions of the Democratic Party. Everybody knows about, for example, Emmett Till and the impact that the visitation of Emmett Till's body had on the civil rights movement. Well, Dawson was the one who secretly worked with Mississippi politicians to get Emmett Till up here. Or up to Chicago. Without Dawson, that wouldn't have happened. And there were many things of that nature. He also played a key role in desegregation of the military. And the question that I was really interested in with Dawson was, to what extent could electoral politics be useful in making civil rights change? And the answer that I came up with that book was, as long as your vote is up for grabs, it can make a big difference. Once your vote is no longer up for grabs, it changes. And so what's kind of interesting about Dawson's career, it spans the period from when African Americans were largely Republican to when they became largely Democratic, which people often think is in the 1930s, but that doesn't actually happen solidly until the mid to late 1960s. And so that's why he was able to leverage that work.
Wow, that's fascinating. I assume that came out of your being at Northwestern and the whole Chicago. Or is that where
Yeah.
you're from originally?
No,
Or
I was an Army kid,
yeah,
and I fell in love with Chicago because of my age. Chicago Bulls, Mayor Harold Washington, the Cubs. Like, I thought it was the greatest city in the world, and I wanted to be there. And what I was sort of really interested in there, Chicago's an interesting city. I had a couple questions I was interested in. I was really interested in, how is it that you had folks who were of non-white European races? So late 19th century, people who are Irish or Italian or Jewish or even Spanish, German, they are not necessarily white. Ben Franklin much earlier wrote that there's only one group of people who are white, and those were folks who are Anglo-Saxon. In his biography, he goes on at length about how all these other people don't meet the qualifications. So it was very interesting to me how folks who were distinctly not white became white, and became empowered to be part of the American political process. But folks who, African Americans, we range the gamut in terms of skin color. We've been here a long time. We know the culture very well. We know the language, but we were never able to make that transition. And it's not just about the external expression of it, because if that were the case, our racial system would be much more simple. So I was really interested in understanding what that interaction between Blacks and the political process was. I was also really interested in what drives ordinary people into political action. And in that way, that first book is not dissimilar from the current book. A fundamental question I've always been interested in is, how do you take the ordinary person, someone who's just like me, who is not necessarily see themselves as a political actor, how do they transition to being a political or social actor?
sure, sure. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Again, I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. I'm James Wilson. I'm the marketing and sales manager for LSU Press. We're going to be doing things a little bit differently today from our regular author series, where the authors do a straight presentation. We're going to be doing a little bit more of a question and answer format today. We certainly welcome audience participation, and we're going to get to a Q&A portion with author questions near the end. I also want to remind folks that there will be a discount code posted in the comment section on Facebook. That's where you can post your questions as well. The discount code will be good for 40% off when you buy the book from the LSU Press website. And I want to say welcome to our guest, our author today, Christopher Manning. Uh, a former Army brat and professional Latin dancer and choreographer, Manning received his PhD in history from Northwestern University in 2003.
Yes.
Uh, he served as the Vice President for Student Affairs and Campus Diversity at San Diego State University since 2023. And again, thanks for being here today.
Happy to be here.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? We were talking about your first book previously, but tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to this project that we're talking about today, which I guess we should show the audience the book at this point as well.
That's it.
We came to rebuild New Orleans.
Yeah. So I guess probably the most important element of my background, at least as I see it, is that I was raised in a military family and went around much of the United States and Central Europe as my dad was stationed in different places. And one of the things that I always found challenging as an Army brat, or at least as a military child, where you're in an environment where you have everyone, every race, every ethnicity, at every level, officers, NCOs, etc. And you're also in environments where if you don't learn how to get to know other people and learn what's beautiful about them and learn what's sort of wonderful about their cultures, you're not going to survive. And then I would come back to the States and I would find myself kind of pigeonholed, at least by how folks in the States saw me. And so I was always kind of interested in fundamentally how Americans became sort of more open and more willing to accept everyone as part of the citizenry. So a lot of my early work in undergrad was kind of focused on forms of nationalism. I did a lot of work on the 1920s Ku Klux Klan. I was actually more interested, that was the first time I encountered Louisiana, because I was really interested in those places where the Klan didn't succeed very well. And it didn't in New Orleans compared to other parts of the city, largely because of New Orleans Catholic heritage. And the Klan at that time was very anti-Catholic. And so that just wasn't going to fly. So it became kind of a political vehicle, but it did not have the same lasting impact in New Orleans, at least, as it did in other cities. So I did the first book trying to understand how political empowerment happened through civil rights, or excuse me, civil rights empowerment happened through politics. But even in that first book, it's a political biography. I was always a little concerned about how history, when written from kind of a standard historical scholarly perspective, may not be interesting. So I wrote it about that one individual, William L. Dawson, as a vehicle to bring the reader in. I wanted the readers to get to know him as a person and learn history through his experience. And when I went to New Orleans in 2008 as a volunteer, I saw a lot of things there that really interest me. First of all, I was very suspicious of that what I saw around me looked a lot like the civil rights movement. I saw a lot of young people. I saw a lot of really motivated people. I saw some chaos. I saw good hearts. I saw people doing gut-wrenching and difficult work. And I remember I was at Operation Helping Hands at their dinner and for us when we finished, and I said, one day someone's going to write the history of this and they'll realize it was the first civil rights movement of the 21st century. Just when you look at the expansiveness of it, almost 2 million people coming to volunteer from all over the country, really doing human rights work, it needed to be documented. And the vehicle of oral history did a lot of what I wanted to do in the Dawson book. It takes history and it personalizes it. It makes it real people that you can really care about. And through wanting to care about and learn about the experiences of the people, you get all the historical lessons that you can want as well.
Yeah, I think it's a good point here. We're gonna shake things up a little in terms of the chronology, because I think it's a good point to tell people a little about the structure of the book. The core of the book, the first part of the book, is on these interviews that you did with these volunteers. Why don't you talk a little bit about the structure of the book to give them a little bit more a sense of how the book is organized?
Yeah, so thank you. I really appreciate that question. So with my first book, I tried as much as I could, new author, but I tried as much as I could to make it inviting and open to any kind of reader. Again, by going through the vehicle of this person's life, really make it a life story that taught lessons. I taught oral history at Loyola University in Chicago for about at the time that I started this book, it may be about just under 10 years. And we read some great books in that class. Theodore Rosengarten's book, All God's Dangers, really stands out as one of my favorites. Really good bit of Southern history there. What I and my students often found was that we wanted more of the voices of the participants. A lot of times you would hear the historian's voice, how they processed it, and their arguments and their theories, etc. But time and again, my students, I felt like we wanted to hear the voices of the participants. Now, if you want to get really detailed, the historian is always there because they're the ones who edit the manuscript and select what chunks, etc. But what I really wanted to do was to convey in an emotionally visceral way, and we can talk about that more if you want, the experiences of the slices of folks who were in there. So the first 7 chapters are of long form interviews of participants. You have 2 interviews of very young people who were transitioning right out of college, one male, one female. You have the experience of someone who also came from the Northeast and started her own nonprofit. Then we transitioned to sort of like middle tier folks who were higher up the administrative chart. We talked to Robert Goodman, who was in Safe Streets, Safe Communities, about criminal justice reform. And he has like a wonderful, compelling story. And we also talked to one of my favorite interviews, Jay Welch from Southeast Louisiana Legal Services, and just the stories that Jay told, both in terms of his own evacuation process and, how he and his other lawyer friends got back into the work because they needed something to do. They were so distraught by what was going on in their lives. They needed to get back into the fight. And then the last chapters, we pivot more towards a couple of folks who were the heads of the large organizations to understand what it was like to run a rebuilding together in New Orleans and try to mobilize dozens and dozens and dozens of volunteers on a monthly basis to do this work, while at the same time not getting paid back their grants from the state government, running the risk of having millions of dollars in loans, not knowing if they're going to get their grants repaid, because as Rivero put it, you might get $100,000 grant revoked because you didn't document spending on a pencil correctly. So those first 7 interviews really give you that personalized experience. And if you just love people and you love New Orleans and you want to learn more about the rebuilding process, those are the folks to look at. But then if you're very into the scholarly portion, the last 2 chapters are more of a synthesis and theoretical analysis. The first analysis is on what were the motivations that we found for people to do this? Like, why would someone take 1, 2 years, 3 years of their lives and just be engaged in this work? And then the last chapter analyzes whether or not this is really an effective way to do the work.
That's fascinating. I love the what you started with in terms of the collective action. You were talking about all of these people coming together for this united cause and this first civil rights movement of the 21st century. And then these personal experiences and letting them speak for themselves. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my experience since I'm from Louisiana. I was here at the time. And then I promise you it's going to lead into a question about some of the interviews that you conducted and some of the stories that you got back. So I was fortunate enough, I was living in New Orleans up until 2004. We evacuated, well, we didn't evacuate, we moved. I relocated to Lafayette, Louisiana, about two miles west of here in the summer of 2004. And so when Katrina hit, I was teaching at the University of Louisiana Lafayette. And I had, my best friend, they evacuated. They stayed through the storm. They came, they didn't get out until the Thursday after the storm. So they stayed here. It was very traumatic for them, living through this, how they were going to get out. And they came and they stayed with us for a few weeks over in Lafayette. But to me, being removed, it really didn't have the kind of impact at the time of what the magnitude of what was happening. And so it wasn't until the spring of '06 when the actual rebuilding was getting underway, people were starting to settle back into their lives, that something happened with me that really impacted the way I viewed the whole thing. And I think it kind of speaks to some of these experiences that you cover in the book. And what happened is I had a student, and he was a senior architecture student. He was just trying to finish up his degree. He was from New Orleans. His family lived here. They lived in Pontchartrain Park, which is, if you know anything about the city, if you know about the history, that was a neighborhood built for working class blacks in the, I think, 1940s, 1950s, around that era. It was hit very hard with Hurricane Katrina. Uh, you know, basically everyone there lost everything. So his family was struggling to rebuild in the wake of the storm. He wanted to try to finish up his degree so he could go back and be a part of that. Again, this is just a few months after the storm, spring of '06. He was in my Louisiana history class. We were a few weeks away from finishing up the semester, so probably April. He had done well in the class and everything, but he wasn't there one day. And then the next day, I read in the newspaper there was a woman who she had the burden of trying to put back her family's life. They had a family business. They were trying to rebuild, and she just couldn't take it anymore. And it turns out she ended up taking the life of her special needs child and then committing suicide. And it turns out it was this student's mom and their sibling. And that's when it kind of hit me, the gravity of what was happening and the emotional and psychological toll and damage that the storm did. And I mean, I still get emotional when I think about that. And when we talk about rebuilding, it wasn't simply the physical rebuilding of the city. That was the smaller part of the act. And so I want you to speak to that emotional and psychological impact that this experience had on these volunteers, whether it was a motivating factor, but also how it impacted them that on that level.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say there. You might just have to stop me and just tell me it's time to move on. I mean, first, I did want to, I was taking a look at my Kindle real quick here because I want to give a shout out to Vincan Adams, who wrote the book Markets of Sorrow, Labors of Faith. And Adams really talked about the way in which the survivors were being re-traumatized and re-traumatized and re-traumatized because of the bureaucratic inefficiencies of Road Home, as run by ICF International. I do want to be very clear that Road Home was not a governmental failure. Road Home was a failure of using private companies to engage in large-scale social rebuilding. That never should have happened. It's a terrible model. But Adams talked about, like, people were being re-traumatized on a weekly, sometimes daily basis. And so I wanted to capture those emotions. So let's maybe talk about the first one. The first story in the book, it was about a young man named Daniel Manriquez, who was with Operation Helping Hands. And Daniel was our crew leader when we were going to we were on a painting crew. And we were there on time. We were, you know, a group of 30 somethings who were ready to do some good work. And we got our gear. We went to the person's house. We waited for an hour. They didn't show up. We waited for another hour. They didn't show up. Meanwhile, it's getting hot. We were getting kind of disgruntled, and, you know, our attitude wasn't the best. Daniel shows up with a homeowner, and they look at the place and they leave, and they don't come back for another hour. And at that point, we were kind of like, well, we came here to do this work. We're just sitting here for an hour, and we were kind of frustrated. And this guy, Daniel, couldn't have been more than 22 years old. He taught us, he said, this person has hardly been able to make a decision about their own home for the last 3 years. So choosing what color paint they want to do for their home is of an importance to them that I'm not sure you all are grasping at this moment. And so this 22-year-old kid took all of these professionals and taught us a life lesson, and we just sat and we waited for her to figure it out. Daniel was a very interesting example of some of the other emotional challenges that people experienced. One of the things that I noticed that the young folks experienced, Daniel Manriquez, Caitlin Riley, who was with Common Ground, they were both with Common Ground. A lot of the young people who were long-term full-time volunteers really were living a life that was extraordinarily unsustainable. They were working 60, 70-hour work weeks. With Common Ground, for example, the expectation was that you would work 8-9 hours a day in the field and then come back and work several hours at the home that they were in. The conditions in which they were living were not best. And one of the things that was very challenging for the younger people that I saw that was really difficult for them emotionally was that there was really very little self-care, very little self-care. They were doing extraordinarily emotionally difficult and physically difficult work, especially during the gutting, where they were going through people's memories. And for the most part, with a few exceptions, maybe Habitat did a better job at this. There was very little mental health or psychological support for that. And one of the things that was a common theme among the younger volunteers was utilizing alcohol, in some cases drugs, in some cases promiscuity, to kind of self-medicate during this process. And it wasn't good for them. It wasn't good for them. Both Daniel Manriquez and Caitlin Riley had to ultimately leave Common Ground to find more healthy environments where they could be whole. To a certain extent, they needed to actually make a little money. They were making no money. It was extraordinarily hard. As you get to some of the older folks, let's kind of talk about let's see. Oh yeah, let's talk about Robert Goodman, as well as the founder of Bayou Rebirth, Colleen Morgan. Folks who were in, and we can't forget Fred Franke. Fred Franke's amazing. Folks who started nonprofits in response to a need, they had a real different challenge, with Morgan, who started Bayou Rebirth, and Franke, who started Operation Nehemiah, and Goodman, who was on the ground with Safe Streets, Safe Communities. It was really clear that the work was valuable. So in the case of Bayou Rebirth, it was wetlands restoration. Fred Franke had this really beautiful model of sort of situating a Christian revitalization as the center of rebuilding. And Goodman was really involved in criminal justice reform. They were really challenged by resources. So in the case of Goodman and Morgan, their organizations had grant support early on. But one of the things that we find in the research is that you can't just give new social entrepreneurs grants and say go, because one of the things that they found was that, well, they didn't have enough support to do the auditing, trying to figure out how to do all the paperwork, and the amount of stresses on them was ridiculous. It was so hard. I mean, Morgan talked about how she was essentially a one-woman show for the first 3 years. She got a huge grant. The grant was too big for her to do alone. She's not sleeping right. She's not eating right, trying to do all this programming, get it off the ground. And then comes the recession. And when the recession hit, she couldn't get another grant, and she had to figure out a different way to generate revenue for the organization. And it was just stress after stress after stress after stress after stress. Not dissimilarly, Goodman talked about the stresses on Safe Streets, Safe Communities, and he wished that they had had more advising early on, that when all the money was coming in to the city, that they could have gotten with other organizations and pooled their money to just buy their own building. Even buying their own building and allowing different customers to rent part of the building would have allowed for revenue generation to sustain themselves, but they were sort of constantly chasing after grants. And there was a tremendous tension that was between trying to get grant funding and do the work. And then Franke was interesting. He just more or less decided that grants weren't for him at all. He just did not have the team to do it. And he had to sort of base it on those services. But, Franke talked about how he had, like, again, 60, 70, 80-hour work weeks, not getting enough sleep, so tired, so hard to do the work. But everyone was so motivated to do as much as they could that they did it. Last but not least, with the established organizations, Daniela Rivero, who's the executive director of Rebuilding Together New Orleans, what was extraordinarily challenging for her, which is folks in your audience would know about, was the toxic drywall situation. And Rebuilding Together New Orleans took some drywall from Habitat, who had received it from a Chinese company. The drywall had not gone through an inspection process for its validity and usage, and it was causing health problems. It was messing up wiring. It made people's homes smell. And just the way that that played out, there was the organizations that received the drywall, at least as Daniela Rivera tells the story, they could never get a straight answer from Habitat. So they had to figure out, do we spend $20,000 per house to redo the 50, 60, 100, 150 houses we've already done? When do we tell our customers? Our clients. Rivero said the single worst moment in her time, or the single worst moments in her time in rebuilding together New Orleans, were when she had to tell volunteers who were coming from Kansas, Iowa, California, Chicago, New York, etc., that they were going to tear down a house that had just been rebuilt so they could put new drywall in. So the strains and stresses were extraordinary. And the fact that some of these folks were able to do it for more than 1 or 2 years is a real credit to them.
Yeah, I mean, the one of the themes here is what someone from the outside might not realize in terms of the rebuilding. First of all, was the yes, you see the scope of the work, but it wasn't simply rebuilding a house. It was like you're saying, all the bureaucracy, all of the small little things in terms of the victims that or the survivors that are you're working with, their trauma that you're negotiating, but then all the paperwork, that the housing, the food for the volunteers, all of the different logistical things. It just added on to the actual rebuilding itself. It was such a small factor in the overall process. Now, you talked about the at the beginning in terms of this movement and the movement. One thing to keep in mind is that there wasn't really a playbook like the civil rights movement. There wasn't really a playbook for this. This was something that was being, made up as we moved forward at the time, and so
Yeah.
that was an important component to it. But how about long-term viability? And in terms, we know a lot of the motivations of why people came here. They were altruistic and good motivations. But what about dealing with all of these levels of obstacles that were being put in front of them to sustain that kind of momentum and move forward? How did that go about, and how did that happen?
Well, I mean, the answer to your question is it didn't. There was no, as far as my research was concerned, I saw no coordinated and sustained effort to do the work over the long term. At best, you saw organizations with capacity, such as Rebuilding Together New Orleans, or also a St. Bernard Project, or a Common Ground, try to keep their individual efforts sustainable. But there was little to no broad coordinated effort. For example, there was an organization called NoDRIP, Greater New Orleans Disaster Relief. I have it in my index, the whole acronym. But let's see, where is it? Oh, there you go. Greater New Orleans Disaster Relief Program. But none of the volunteers referred to NoDRIP. Most of them didn't even know that it existed. Not just at the sort of entry level, but at the management level. Fred Franke, who ran Operation Nehemiah, knew it existed. And interestingly, he got the name wrong often. And Franke's smart. He was giving me data about how hurricanes move, the directions they flow, historical data. It's all in his interview. And I sort of realized that the fact that Franke couldn't even remember the name was indicative of how unimportant the organization was. Franke talked about how he had sent some of his team to participate in the coordination efforts, but they were so overwhelmed with dealing with the real-time needs of folks that they just didn't have time. There was one negative story, and then I'll try to get back to your question. Franke realized that at one point the organization was asking people for their data, like who they were helping, etc. But then groups within the broader coalition were using other people's data for their own grant applications. And Franke was great. He was so funny. I got along with him so well. He said that I don't have a problem with pooling resources, but I do have a problem with you pulling my resources. So even when folks did get together, it did not prove very effective in nature. This is one of the things Daniel Manriquez talked about this early in his interview also, and he was the only person who was in the younger bracket who got really sort of analytical and theoretical. He was the only person in the younger bracket who criticized the volunteer program or the volunteer effort as being somewhat neoliberal in nature, in that like this is the state really should be doing this. We shouldn't be doing this. We did have older volunteers who did that, but I think he was the only younger person to note it. And one of the things that he pointed out was that from his perspective, there were a lot of inefficiencies that could just be costing money and time. So if you have Rebuilding Together New Orleans that focuses on one type of client, and you have another organization that focuses on an area, and you have another organization that focuses on, let's say, a socioeconomic bracket, but all of you are sending cars all over New Orleans, expending gas in ways that are inefficient, and there are still gaps in the city, Manriquez pointed out, that's not ideal. So there was very little coordination at the macro level. The most coordination I saw was very, very micro, very micro. So a very common one, I'll give you two common ones. Operation Helping Hands had a very well-stocked storehouse of tools and supplies. So it was very common for other organizations to borrow their tools when going out and doing the work. Another one, Common Ground, had more volunteers than they could shake a stick at. So it was not unusual for people like, say, Colleen Morgan from Bayou Rebirth to go to Common Ground and say, you got some volunteers? I need someone for a project. Or for Fred Franke to do something of that nature. Fred Franke put it best. He said most of the interworking between organizations happened from interpersonal relationships between folks in those organizations. I asked Franke, I asked everyone, did they have any evidence of any level of the state attempting to get people on the same page, attempting to bring folks together in a room, attempting to provide like even maps to show them data of what's needed where? And the answer was always no, zero. Some folks, the common answer was that the state had no impact on their work at all. And the next answer was, if anything, the state made their work harder to do. So I walked away feeling that if we're going to do something like this in the future, my preference would be to see local government or state government not try to control the process, but act as more of a clearinghouse to provide people with the data to see the macro picture so that the resources could be utilized efficiently.
And that was addressing the specific situation of Katrina in the long term and these recovery efforts. But let's go back, even zoom out even further in terms of the macro level. Do you think any of the lessons were learned, and do you think we're more well prepared now? And do you think if it's not from the government organizational structure, maybe the proliferation of nonprofit, community-oriented sort of endeavors might make us more well prepared to deal with something like this today?
That's a very hard question to answer. Primarily, the difficulty lies in the fact that, in my opinion, there hasn't been anything comparable to Katrina that has happened since that time. 80% of a city underwater, the number of deaths, we just haven't had anything like it. So it's really hard to compare. I will say that although this wasn't the primary focus of my research, but secondarily, it does appear to me that FEMA is more prepared for disaster recovery in the short term, somewhat. I don't like, we do have some reason to believe, especially what we saw in Los Angeles, and even 10, 15 years ago, what we saw in Puerto Rico, we've still got some gaps. I don't have faith that as a political entity, we fully grasp that there is a role for government to play in some of the most critical events in this country. We have gone so far down the road that thinking that private companies and privatized citizens can do better. I don't know that we've walked it back to see that we have a government for a reason. When it comes to the private side, those of you who had to suffer through ICF's incompetence, you essentially experience ICF getting a $7 billion contract and sitting on the money for 3 years. Their stock went up. It's great for their shareholders. They got bigger contracts. Great for their shareholders. They didn't spend any money. Great for their shareholders. There is no motivation for a private company unless accountability with deadlines and ramifications are built into the contracting. There's no essential motivation for private companies to do a social good. There just isn't. So you need elected officials to ensure that if you are going to do contracts with private companies, that the levels of accountability and the deliverables, those have to be hard. And if they're not met, that money comes back. Because if ICF International failed, the people of New Orleans can't vote out their CEO. They can't stop that person from getting a bonus. And then on the other hand, talking about government, private individuals are amazing. I think one of the principal lessons to be drawn from New Orleans is that despite being a pretty politically divided country at that time period, people came from all 50 states repeatedly. And they were in their 20s and their 30s and their 40s and their 50s and their 60s and their 70s. And they came to a very unique city. You're not going to find a New Orleans in the middle of Minnesota. So they weren't coming because it was people who were like them. They were coming to a place that was very distinct. And it reminds us of the sort of fundamental love and care that Americans have. But you cannot take 1.5 million people coming from 50 states and expect them to have the capacity to organize on a macro level in a place as complicated as New Orleans. There needed to be some level of government intervention, at a minimum, just providing information, maps of the city, what parts are hardest hit, how could your resources be best utilized, trying to prevent, for example, why would you have Operation Helping Hands and Common Grounds competing for the same grants in the exact same geographic region? Makes no sense. Why would you have folks doing, one of the things that was also really problematic was that the way in which the nonprofits executed their work, they got grants for different kinds of work. So you would get a grant for paint, you would get a grant for lead remediation, you would get a grant for framing up a house, you would get a grant for doing gutting a house. And what their clients had to do was fill out new paperwork every time. So if you went to Operation Helping Hands, you had to fill out their paperwork. You'd fill out paperwork at Common Ground. You'd fill out paperwork at St. Bernard Project. It was incredibly inefficient under the guise of efficiency. So the guise of efficiency was that, well, if we have all of this, if everyone has to prove that they have a real need, sort of classic American needy poor, so to speak, if we have to prove that they have a need, we'll make sure that you're getting the money that you deserve. But it actually just made for terrible hoops. So I'm not confident that our nation is at a point that it values government for what it can do for the good of the people right now.
Yeah, and I certainly think that the response, at least here in New Orleans, at virtually every level, would be that mistrust, mistrust might not be the right word, but they certainly would say it's well founded given some of the experiences. Right now there's still, FEMA grant money to rebuild a lot of the infrastructure of the city was about to expire. And so there was this huge overhaul to try to get these construction roads specifically done over the last year or two. And so it's just been a nightmare. But it's the same sort of inefficiencies that you're talking about. But I want to try to take it back to the book to a certain degree. The individuals that you interviewed in the book, what was their long term? What was the long term lesson that they learned from this? Did they stay within the nonprofit role? Did they transition to other areas? How did they evolve now, 20 years later? What are they doing?
Yeah, it's so interesting to be alive in this era because I can actually just go on LinkedIn and see what's going on with folks. So a couple things. Going to the book itself, it was very common for people who were in their 20s who came to New Orleans and did the long-term work. The vast majority of them expressed a desire to stay and to become a part of New Orleans and to continue to contribute to the public good. For those who were middle-aged, most of them had already been in helping professions. And so their work in New Orleans was really a chapter in their lives. It wasn't something radically new. The only exception was Fred Franke, who was essentially a small business person. And he had a vision from God really that led him to want to do this work. But almost everyone else was already in a helping profession. So it was kind of just a chapter in their lives, so to speak, and they continued to do it as well. Some people, the time in New Orleans transformed them to want to continue doing civic good. So I would say that what I've observed just by trying to keep up with these wonderful folks on LinkedIn and other areas, almost all of them are still involved in something that's socially conscious or civically oriented. Many stayed in New Orleans for quite some time after the interview. Several I see have left, but most of them have continued their involvement in the public good. Here's something that's very interesting, though, James. It wasn't New Orleans that did that, I would argue. When I looked at the motivation and the characteristics that the volunteers had, they had some very common characteristics. They all tended to be highly educated, minimally college degrees, but graduate work was normal. Most of them had volunteering experience before New Orleans. So if we have any educators on the line, those of us who do engaged learning, civic learning as part of our curricula, it works. It leads people to be socially and civic minded. A lot of them were legacy volunteers, so their parents had been involved in other social movements and took them to movements also, and they just sort of carried it forward. So I actually ended up ultimately arguing in the book that New Orleans was, while for the younger people, it did happen at a time of transition in their lives, and that's key. That is key. I argued that overall, New Orleans represented an evolution of a pattern that was already established in their lives, rather than leading them to something entirely new. I'm suspicious, but I didn't do this work on these folks. I'm suspicious that if you look at the short-term volunteers, like the people who were like me, who came for a week or two, now those folks, I think they might be different. But the long-term volunteers had all of the characteristics of people who greatly cared about their fellow human beings, even before New Orleans happened.
Well, well. First of all, I want to remind folks that are listening today that if you have questions, go ahead and post them in the comment section, and we'll address them if we can, if we have time. I think one interesting aspect of this is also when it happened and the changes in technology. Because this was we had cable news and 24/7 coverage at the time, but we didn't have the personal nature of social media the way we do today. So I think in that way, it certainly plays a role here, but I'm not sure exactly how. But it
Yeah.
would certainly be a much different experience today if it would happen. Not just the infrastructure and what we've learned from the bureaucratization and that sort of thing, but the coverage itself. But how much do you think that broader coverage that was available at the time played in people's motivation to go
Yeah.
and actually get involved?
It's huge. The theory that I refer to in the book, it's called convergence behavior. And a very common theme in the interviewees is that they could not believe this was happening in America to fellow Americans. Let me repeat that. A very common theme was that they could not believe it was happening in America to Americans. And convergence behavior argues that when you can see some similarity between yourself and someone who has been the victim of some horrible action, disaster, etc., that will lead people to converge upon that point and want to help. And so what happened after Katrina was a little difficult to explain. New Orleans is a very unique city. It had a very large African-American population, and it was Southern with Spanish, French, and English origins. So the gentleman who was a carpenter from Idaho wasn't coming to New Orleans because he was helping people like him. Or the young lady who was working in an intentional community in the Bronx wasn't coming to New Orleans because the people she was helping were like her. The one phenomenon that I could find was the shock at seeing the repeated images on TV and folks saying, I can't believe other Americans are going through this here. And it's really, to me, it's really remarkable that this empathy, sympathy, and desire to help was so focused on lifting up other Americans. And one other thing I would point to, though, I do think that what you saw in New Orleans during Katrina and after Katrina was that there were innumerable social problems that could be addressed. So that's why we looked at the criminal justice system. That's why we looked at the legal structure, et cetera. But the overwhelming work was on homes and home rebuilding. I would argue that that was largely because of the predisposition of the media during the storm and its focus on the destruction of housing. So what you almost see in the way in which the volunteering played out afterwards was that it almost all funneled into home rebuilding. There's a great case to be made that volunteering could have funneled into wetlands remediation or wetlands restoration, right? That's a problem of a massive scale. Getting people into the wetlands, doing some restoration efforts, and then in getting them to go back home and write their congressperson, that is just as valuable as home rebuilding, given that the wetlands formed the barrier that would have kind of slowed the storm down. So I don't think that it's by accident that it occurred. I think it was largely so much media focus was on the homes that people like me in Chicago, that's all we were kind of thinking about. We didn't see the bigger picture. I didn't see the bigger picture until I got down there and talked to more people. Fortunately, Common Ground, Safe Streets, Bayou Rebirth, SLLS did, but there were many more areas where the work could have been done.
So, okay, to bring this kind of full circle, I think I'm going to try to do this, and it may be something that you've never thought about, or that you may have, and we may just not have time to cover it. But you talked about African Americans in this sense of other. Obviously, I think Du Bois probably played a strong emphasis there, and where you came from with your first book. But seeing that same sort of thing here, and obviously Katrina, the response to Katrina, it was racialized. There was a racial element to what was happening here. So did this episode further that sense of other, or did it bring African Americans more into being a part of that whole part of the United States because of this collective experience? Hey, we all went through this. People were coming here. Can't believe this is happening to other Americans here in America when it was largely happening to African Americans. So, what role did this play in that whole sense that you were talking about in being outside that American?
Oh gosh, you know what? I'm not prepared to answer that. So I'll try to answer parts of it. I think if you look at it from a purely data perspective and the population of New Orleans, one could argue that Katrina had a really negative effect in terms of African American incorporation, their ability to live in the city, their ability to afford to live in the city, et cetera. And there are many people who would strongly argue that there were powerful market and political forces that utilized the storm as a Trojan horse for getting rid of public housing that from a physical standpoint was still quite strong and had really vibrant communities in it. Also, there was Charity Hospital and its removal as well. So there are a lot of data points that would argue that there's no way that you could claim that the efforts that post Katrina, I want to be very careful about this, that post Katrina had an integrative force for African Americans. Next stage of analysis, which actually contradicts what I just said. There were folks like Fred Franke who made the argument that the storm didn't care about your race. And it didn't matter if you were Black or you were white. If you lost your home, you lost your home. And there's work by Vincan Adams that even showed that people that had resources were unable to maneuver through the insurance process and lost their homes also. And so that does have a kind of binding force. Also along those lines, Daniel Manriquez talked about the volunteers who were coming. And he was like, you know, I would be in the field with someone who I know didn't share my political or social beliefs at all. I would probably never talk to this person in a social context, but there we were working in 100-degree weather to help this family. So there are those phenomenon as well. I guess what I would say in conclusion is that in terms of the data relative to how New Orleans looks today, I don't think that the way in which the whole recovery occurred had an integrative effect for African Americans to the extent that they wanted to remain in their homes in New Orleans. The verdict is still out about the 1.5 million people that went to the South, experienced Southern culture, Louisiana culture, New Orleans culture, and New Orleans Black culture.
Yeah.
That they never would have experienced otherwise. I can't tell you how many, I have dozens and dozens of stories of how people went to a crawfish boil for the first time and they just blew them away. I had to make a whole theme about it because people kept talking about it over and over again. There's no way to know what the effect of that is. And if there's a way to measure it, I don't have it right now.
Yeah. Well, it didn't happen in a vacuum either, and so that's hard to measure. And we're 20 years removed from it, so there's a lot of variables that go there. But we like to close with this question for our authors. What are you working on now? What's your next project?
Well, so I'm a university administrator. So my next project is trying to have this very large division run within a state of a lot of challenges in higher ed. My time in New Orleans had a real impact on me in that after I came back, I started thinking more about how I could give back to the world. And it was only a few later that I founded my nonprofit, Inspiración Dance Chicago, which I took my Latin dance background, and we started providing Latin dance to city high school programs, which is important because Chicago had some gang issues. Some of those gang issues run along so-called racial lines. Latin dance has African, indigenous, and European roots. So if I could bring together some kids who might not be in a room because of gang lines in the north side of Chicago, but I can get them to dance salsa and bachata together for an hour, we were trying to do good for society. So the research that I did in New Orleans really motivated me to give back more. As a matter of fact, that's why I started doing administration, because I fundamentally believe in higher ed as a transformative force. And in the division that I lead, it's not coincidental that our second strategic priority is community well-being. We have a lot of people who are mission driven and will give everything for the students, but they don't know that they need to take care of themselves. And part of the reason you have to take care of yourself is that if you don't take care of yourself in being a caregiver, you're not going to give the best care. So you have to make sure you take care of your vehicle. You have to make sure you take care of your own spirit so that you can give the very best to your communities. And so much of that lesson was dawned upon me in my work in New Orleans. If I do another research project, and it is in the making right now, we are provisionally talking about doing an oral history project with veterans here in the San Diego area to understand the veterans' experience over the last 20 years, especially during the War on Terror, and also to provide, I don't know, more guidance to the young people who are going into the military and help them to make that decision. I come from a military family. The military changed our lives. I unfortunately didn't go in, but hopefully I can give back in that way.
Excellent. Sounds like the next chapter in Christopher Manning's book of life, his next story. Well, thank you for joining us today. Thank you everyone who's streaming with us here today. Remember, there's a discount code in the comment section there. And is there anything you want to say to close, Christopher?
I would just say we live in times where, unfortunately, we have a lot of questions about our neighbor. We have a lot of questions about the things that people are thinking and they're doing, and there's a lot of suspicion and doubt. One of the things that I think is so beautiful about this book is that you get to see the true spirit of the American people, the true willingness that we have to support one another and care for each other in the worst times. So if you're looking for some inspiration and you want to really see what we can truly aspire to as a caring and loving people, take the time to read those first 7 chapters. You'll come away feeling better about yourself.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you.